The scroll had been sitting in the darkest corner of the library for longer than anyone could remember, its cracked leather tube coated in a thick layer of dust. Most visitors never ventured into that neglected alcove where the air smelled faintly of parchment and old candle smoke. But for Clara Valente, the quiet librarian who preferred solitude over chatter, that forgotten corner was a place of comfort. She had always believed that the greatest stories in history weren't the ones written in bestsellers. They were the ones buried and waiting, hidden between shelves no one touched. Her fingertips brushed against the brittle leather, and the faint crumbling sound made her pause. She pulled it from its resting place, surprised by its unexpected weight. The leather strap had long since snapped, so she simply unfurled it on the nearby reading desk, careful not to tear the ancient fibers. The first thing she noticed was that it wasn't written in Latin, at least not entirely. Columns of unfamiliar symbols were scattered across the faded ink, interwoven with lines of Roman script. At first, she thought it might be damage from time, but no, these symbols were deliberate. Repeating patterns, precise spacing, deliberate pauses in the text. Clara's heart gave a small, quickened beat. Her years cataloguing manuscripts had taught her one thing. A document this unusual was never meant for casual reading. She leaned closer, tracing the symbols with the tip of her finger. They seemed to mock her with their silence, daring her to understand. From the mezzanine above, the late afternoon sunlight streamed down, catching the gold flecks in her brown eyes. She was alone. The other staff had left early, and the building felt like a cathedral of silence. She carefully rolled the scroll again, tucking it under her arm, and made her way to the staff research room. Clara knew she shouldn't remove artifacts from the archive without clearance, but there was something about this piece that stirred a deep, almost irrational urgency in her. She set it on her desk under the warm pool of lamplight and began cross-referencing the symbols in her personal notebooks. The shapes were sharp and geometric, some resembling runes, others like fragments of Greek letters, but arranged in no known order. It wasn't until she remembered a lecture from her university days that a faint recognition stirred in her mind. A guest scholar had once spoken about a private cipher used by a Roman ruler obsessed with secrecy, one whose reign was marked by both great prosperity and political paranoia. Clara had dismissed the story back then as academic gossip, but now, staring at these very symbols, she wondered if the rumor had been true. She pulled a stack of reference books toward her, flipping rapidly through their pages. Slowly, piece by piece, the patterns began to take shape in her mind. These weren't random. They were substitutions, letters hiding beneath symbols, meaning buried in plain sight. By the time the library's great clock struck 7, Clara's pulse was racing. She had deciphered only a handful of words, but they were enough to keep her breath caught in her throat. Aurum imperatoris, the emperor's gold. Her fingers trembled as she leaned back in her chair. She wasn't ready to tell anyone, not yet, not until she was sure. But deep inside, she knew this was no mere historical curiosity. This scroll was a key, one that could unlock something far greater than she had ever imagined. Somewhere, hidden for centuries, the treasure of an emperor was waiting. If you're enjoying this story of justice and hidden strength, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple act of prejudice turned into the most valuable lesson of a lifetime. The next morning, Clara arrived at the library before dawn, the pale blue light of early morning filtering through the high-arched windows. Her colleagues wouldn't arrive for hours, and that suited her perfectly. She wanted solitude, not just to work without interruption, but to keep this discovery out of curious eyes. She laid the scroll flat on the long oak table in the restricted archives room. With a magnifying glass poised over the parchment, she studied each symbol in turn. The ink had faded to a sepia ghost of its former self, but under magnification the strokes were precise and deliberate, as if the writer had been a master scribe. Her mind kept circling back to the name she hadn't dared write down last night, Emperor Lucius Severinus. And he was a figure spoken of only in whispers among Roman historians, his rule spanning less than a decade in the 2nd century, yet surrounded by an unusual air of mystery. Historical records painted him as both brilliant and dangerously secretive, a man who trusted no one, not even his closest advisors. Lucius Severinus was rumored to have created his own form of encryption for communications with his most loyal aides. Few believed the cipher truly existed. Most thought it was a myth, exaggerated from scraps of unreliable accounts. But Clara now had living proof in her hands. She began aligning the symbols with known Latin letters, cross-referencing them with a rare fragment she had once seen in a private collection catalogue. The progress was slow but exhilarating. More and more words began to reveal themselves like a picture slowly emerging from a fog. Phrases such as Via Aurea, the Golden Path, and Sub Terra Custodiat, kept safe beneath the earth, flickered into clarity. Her breath caught when she stumbled across a longer passage, one that seemed almost like a riddle. The river that forgets will guard the light of Rome until the eagle returns. Clara frowned. It was poetic, but in the context of an emperor known for paranoia, she suspected it was also literal, a coded set of directions. She scribbled notes furiously, her pen scratching against the paper. The more she read, the more convinced she became that this wasn't just about coins or gilded trinkets. If Lucius Severinus truly hid something to guard the light of Rome, it could be an artifact of staggering importance, a symbol of imperial power, perhaps even an object tied to the empire's legitimacy itself. Yet with each breakthrough came a gnawing unease. Secrets of this magnitude had a way of attracting unwanted attention. Clara had no desire to become a name in the kind of modern story where historians mysteriously disappear. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a door opening at the far end of the hall. She quickly rolled the scroll and slid it into her satchel. Moments later, Dr. Adrian Voss entered, the head curator of the library's rare manuscripts. "Working early again, Clara?" His smile was genial, but his eyes lingered on her bag for just a second too long. She nodded, forcing a casual tone. "Just getting ahead on some cataloguing." Voss leaned on the table, his gaze sharp. "If you find anything unusual, be sure to bring it to me first. You know the protocols." Clara's pulse quickened, but she kept her expression neutral. "Of course." When he finally left, she exhaled slowly. She couldn't shake the feeling that her discovery had already cast a shadow and that someone else might be watching. The cipher was only partially solved, but one thing was certain. The Emperor's treasure wasn't just a legend, and now she wasn't the only one who knew it might be real. By the end of the week, Clara had filled an entire notebook with translations, diagrams, and speculative maps. Each night, she would return home to her cramped apartment above a quiet cafe, spread the scroll across her kitchen table, and work until the city outside fell into silence. Sleep came late, but her mind was too alive to rest. The more she decoded, the clearer the Emperor's voice seemed to become, as though Lucius Severinus were whispering across the centuries. The cipher unraveled slowly, revealing fragments of a turbulent final chapter in his life, betrayals by trusted senators, whispers of assassination, and a final act of defiance. It was during those last days, the scroll suggested, that the treasure had been hidden, not in Rome, but somewhere far from the reach of his enemies. One translated passage stood out in particular. "When the laurel withers and the eagle weeps, the gold will rest beneath the river's blind eye." Clara read it aloud, tasting the strange rhythm of the words. She knew the eagle was likely the symbol of Rome, but the river's blind eye puzzled her. It could mean a river that disappeared underground, or one that changed course over centuries. She made a note to cross-reference ancient waterways. But just as the pieces were starting to align, her work was interrupted. Late one afternoon, as she sat alone in the restricted archives room, a man she didn't recognize appeared in the doorway, tall, well-dressed. With an expensive wool coat draped over his arm, he smiled as if they were old acquaintances. "You must be Miss Valente," he said. "I hear you have a gift for finding unusual things." Her hand instinctively moved to cover the scroll, though it was already rolled tight. "I'm sorry, this area is restricted to staff," she replied, her voice even. "Ah, of course," the man said, stepping inside anyway. "My name is Marcus Leto. I'm a collector of Roman antiquities. I've been told there's a document here, very old, very rare, that might interest me greatly." His eyes flicked to her satchel in the corner. Clara felt the air tighten. "If you have an acquisition request, you'll need to speak with Dr. Voss." Leto's smile sharpened. "I prefer to deal directly with the person who made the discovery. Middlemen complicate things." He reached into his coat and slid a white envelope onto the table. "A token of appreciation, should you be inclined to share what you found." Clara didn't touch it. "I'm not for sale," she said, her tone flat. The man's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer, before he picked up the envelope and tucked it away. "Very well. But treasures have a way of drawing attention, Miss Valente. Be careful where you leave your doors unlocked." When he finally left, the silence of the archive felt heavier than before. Clara knew with a certainty that made her chest tighten that she had just met her first rival in this search, and he was the kind of man who would stop at nothing. That night, back in her apartment, she bolted her door and drew the curtains tight. On the table, the scroll waited under the lamplight. She ran her fingers over its ancient surface, the symbols now more familiar, almost intimate. The emperor had been betrayed once before. She would not let history repeat itself. The following days at the library felt different. Every footstep in the hall, every unexpected knock on her office door set Clara's nerves on edge. She noticed Dr. Voss lingering more often than usual, asking casual but pointed questions about her current projects. More unsettling were the unfamiliar faces she occasionally glimpsed in the main reading room. Well-dressed men pretending to browse, but whose eyes followed her whenever she passed. Marcus Leto's visit had not been an idle warning. One rainy afternoon, Clara decided it was too risky to keep the scroll in the library any longer. She slipped it into a protective tube, hid it inside the false bottom of her satchel, and carried it home under the cover of her umbrella. The streets of the old city were slick with rain, cobblestones shining under the dim street lamps. She kept her head down, but her instincts told her she wasn't alone. At the corner of Via Cavour, she stopped abruptly, pretending to adjust her bag. Across the street, half hidden under a shop awning, a man in a grey coat stood smoking. His posture was too still, his gaze too fixed. When she resumed walking, so did he. She ducked into the narrow lane beside her building, her heart pounding. It was a risk to lead him so close to her apartment, but she needed to confirm her suspicion. A quick glance over her shoulder proved it. He had followed. Clara slipped through the heavy wooden door of her building and climbed the stairs 2 at a time. She listened by the crack of her apartment door for several minutes before the sound of footsteps receded. It was clear the hunt for the scroll had already begun. That night, she set to work under the dim light of her desk lamp, determined to accelerate her progress. She brought out her reference maps, tracing possible river systems from the 2nd century. One in particular caught her attention, the Clitunno River in Umbria. In ancient times, local legend called it the Blind River because it vanished into underground channels before re-emerging miles away. Her pulse quickened. The next fragment of the cipher mentioned a stone guardian and 4 arches facing the Eagle's Rise. Clara cross-referenced architectural styles from Lucius Severinus's reign. A half-forgotten ruin in the hills north of Spoleto matched the description, a crumbling aqueduct whose arches once framed the eastern horizon. Her excitement was tempered by a sudden, sharp knock at her door. She froze. It was late, far too late for neighbors. She remained perfectly still until the sound of retreating footsteps echoed down the stairs. Peering through her curtains, she caught sight of a dark car idling at the far end of the street. Inside, a silhouette was just visible in the driver's seat. She clenched her jaw. If they thought intimidation would drive her to surrender the scroll, they didn't understand who they were dealing with. Clara was no adventurer, no treasure hunter, just a librarian. But she had spent her life piecing together stories others had forgotten, and she would see this one through to its final page. By the next morning, Clara had made her decision. Waiting any longer would only give her pursuers the advantage. She packed lightly, a satchel with her notebook, a portable lamp, her camera, a small trowel, and, most importantly, the scroll sealed in its protective case. She bought a one-way train ticket to Spoleto under her mother's maiden name, paying in cash. The journey wound through the heart of Italy, past olive groves and sunlit vineyards, though Clara hardly noticed the scenery. She kept the satchel on her lap the entire ride, her fingers resting on it as if it were a living thing she had to protect. Every so often she scanned the carriage, checking for anyone watching her. When she arrived, the town was quiet. Rain clouds gathering above the terracotta rooftops. She found a small pensione on the outskirts run by an elderly widow who asked no questions. That evening, in the privacy of her modest room, Clara unrolled the scroll again. Under the glow of her desk lamp, she worked through the final section of the cipher. The symbols seemed almost eager to reveal themselves now, and within an hour she had translated the remaining lines. Beneath the 4th arch, where water once sang, "The guardian waits with eyes of stone." Clara's mind instantly connected it to the aqueduct north of town. Historical records noted its 4 arches facing east, overlooking a stretch of what had once been a bustling Roman road. Before dawn, she set out on foot, the countryside damp with morning mist. The ruins emerged from the fog like the bones of a forgotten giant. Massive stone arches weathered by centuries, their surfaces covered in moss and ivy. Standing before them, Clara felt a chill, as though she had stepped into the very page of history she'd been decoding. She paced along the base of the aqueduct, counting the arches until she reached the 4th. The ground here sloped toward the remnants of a dry channel where the river had once flowed. Kneeling, she brushed away layers of soil and weeds, searching for any sign of a guardian. Her fingers struck stone. Clearing the earth revealed the carved face of a Roman eagle, its wings folded tight against its body. The eyes, once bright, were now dark hollows, but the craftsmanship was exquisite, even after all this time. Clara's pulse raced. She searched the base of the carving until she found a small, square depression concealed behind the eagle's left wing. Reaching into her satchel, she retrieved the trowel and began carefully removing soil from around it. The shape extended deeper than she expected, and soon her tool hit something solid, a slab of fitted stone. It took nearly an hour to work it loose, but when it finally shifted, a narrow opening yawned before her, exhaling a cool, stale breath from the darkness below. Clara hesitated only a moment before switching on her lamp. The beam illuminated a set of worn stone steps descending into the earth. Somewhere behind her, she thought she heard the crunch of a footstep on gravel, but when she turned, the ruins were empty. Clutching the lamp in one hand and the satchel in the other, she took her first step down. The air grew colder, and the sound of her own breathing seemed deafening in the silence. She didn't know what waited at the bottom, but the Emperor's riddle had brought her this far. There was no turning back now. The stairwell was narrow, the walls pressing close on either side. Clara's lamp flickered against damp stone, revealing tool marks carved by hands long dead. The steps spiraled deeper, the air thickening with the scent of earth and age. She counted each turn, her grip tightening on the satchel strap. After what felt like minutes compressed into hours, the stairs ended at an arched doorway. Beyond it stretched a small antechamber, its ceiling low and curved like the inside of a barrel vault. Roman brickwork framed the walls, still sturdy despite centuries underground. The floor was littered with fragments of broken amphorae, their painted surfaces dulled by time. In the center stood a slab of marble, waist-high, its surface etched with the imperial eagle. Clara approached slowly, her eyes scanning for traps, an instinct she barely understood but did not question. The cipher had warned of guardians, and she doubted that was only poetic flourish. As she circled the slab, she noticed a faint line in the floor, a seam outlining a rectangular section just wide enough for a man to pass through. Her breath caught. This could be the entrance to the vault. She knelt, running her fingers along the seam, and felt a small depression near the corner. From her satchel, she withdrew the scroll and held it under the lamplight. One symbol, a stylized laurel leaf, was drawn larger than the rest, positioned beside an eagle's head. On a hunch, she traced the carving on the slab until she found its match, then pressed it. With a soft groan of ancient stone, the slab shifted, tilting upward on hidden hinges. A rush of cold, stale air poured out, carrying the faint metallic tang of coins and the mustiness of sealed chambers. Clara leaned over the opening, her lamplight piercing the darkness below. She saw steps descending into a vast room, the walls glinting faintly. Her chest tightened, not from fear, but from the overwhelming realization that she was standing on the threshold of something untouched for nearly 2,000 years. She descended into the chamber, her boots crunching on a thin layer of dust. The sight before her made her stop in her tracks. Rows of chests, their iron bands rusted but intact, filled the space. Amphorae sealed with wax lined the walls, and in the center, atop a pedestal, rested a golden eagle standard, its wings spread wide, catching the lamplight as if the metal itself still burned with the pride of Rome. Clara stepped closer, her heart pounding in her ears. This wasn't just treasure, this was the imperial regalia of Lucius Severinus, preserved as if awaiting his return. She imagined the last loyal guards sealing this chamber, knowing their emperor would never come back. But the moment of awe shattered with the faint scuff of a boot behind her. She spun, the lamplight flashing across the figure emerging from the stairwell. Marcus Leto's smile glinted like a knife. "I knew you'd lead me here," he said softly, stepping into the room as if it already belonged to him. Her grip tightened on the lamp. "This doesn't belong to you." He glanced around the chamber, eyes drinking in the gold and relics. "It doesn't belong to you either, but you did the hard work.
Consider me here to finish it." Clara took a step back, her mind racing. She had come too far to let him strip history bare. Somewhere in the chamber's shadows, she needed to find a way to stop him before the Emperor's treasure became just another private prize locked away from the world. The lamplight threw long, shifting shadows across the vault, gold glinting like molten fire in the gloom. Clara's pulse hammered in her ears, each beat echoing off the ancient walls.
Marcus Leto advanced slowly, his polished boots crunching against centuries of dust, his gaze fixed on the golden eagle standard at the chamber's center. "You should be proud," he said, his voice smooth but edged with hunger. "Most scholars dream of finding something like this, but they lack your tenacity." Clara's eyes darted around the vault. She needed time, distance, anything to break his focus. Her gaze fell on the wax-sealed amphorae along the wall, likely still holding oil or wine from the Emperor's era. She took a step sideways, feigning retreat. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice steady. "Artifacts like these aren't meant to be sold to the highest bidder. They belong to history." Leto laughed softly. "History doesn't pay for preservation, Miss Valente. Wealth does, and in my hands these treasures will be appreciated." Clara's fingers brushed one of the amphorae. Without hesitation, she shoved it forward. The vessel toppled and shattered on the floor, splashing thick, pungent oil across the stones. Leto cursed, stepping back instinctively as the slick spread toward his boots. "You'll regret that," he hissed, but Clara was already moving, circling toward the slab's exit. He lunged to intercept, but she swung her satchel in a wide arc, striking his shoulder. The scroll's protective case thudded against him, enough to stagger him for a heartbeat. They grappled near the base of the golden eagle standard, its wings gleaming between them. Leto's grip was iron, but Clara twisted free, ducking toward the steps. He caught the strap of her satchel, yanking her backward, and for a moment they froze in a tense standoff, both breathing hard, both unwilling to yield. In the flicker of her lamplight, Clara saw his expression shift, not to rage, but to something colder, more calculating. "If you walk out of here without me," he said,
"You'll never leave this valley alive." She met his gaze without flinching. "Then I suppose I'd better be very fast." With a sudden shove, she sent another amphora crashing to the ground. The oil pooled quickly, seeping toward the chamber's entrance. She swung the lamp downward, the flame licking dangerously close to the slick. Leto froze, reading the intent in her eyes. "You wouldn't," he said. "Try me." For a long moment neither moved. Then with a sharp breath, Leto released her satchel and stepped back. "Take it then," he said, his tone dripping with venom. "But remember, what you found today makes you powerful, and power draws enemies far worse than me." Clara didn't wait for him to change his mind. She backed up the steps, the lamplight bobbing with each stride until the chamber's glow faded behind her. Only when she reached the aqueduct's open air did she let herself exhale. The treasure was still below, untouched for now.
But the world outside would not stay ignorant forever. And she had only bought herself time to decide what to do with the Emperor's secret before others came to claim it. 3 weeks later, the winter sun hung low over Rome, casting pale light across the grand facade of the National Museum. Clara stood on the marble steps, her coat buttoned tight against the wind, watching visitors drift in and out. Somewhere deep inside the museum's archives, the scroll of Lucius Severinus now rested in a climate-controlled vault, registered, catalogued, and protected. It had taken sleepless nights and careful maneuvering to get it there. She had reached out only to those she trusted completely, to historians whose reputations were beyond reproach, and together they had arranged for the artifact's secure transfer under the watch of state officials. The vault beneath the aqueduct remained untouched, its location known to just 3 people. For now, the Emperor's treasure would stay where it had slept for nearly 2 millennia, safe from hands that would strip it bare. Clara had not seen Marcus Leto again, but twice she had noticed a dark car parked near her apartment, and once a plain envelope appeared in her mailbox, empty except for a single laurel leaf pressed between its folds. A message, silent but unmistakable. He was still watching, yet she felt no regret. Standing in the museum's grand hall later that afternoon, she saw the scroll displayed behind reinforced glass for a private exhibition. A small placard credited her as the librarian who uncovered and decoded it. Visitors leaned close to read the translations, their faces lit with the wonder of discovery. In that moment, Clara understood that the treasure had never truly been gold or jewels. It was the story itself, rescued from the shadows of history. The Emperor's voice, once locked in Cipher, now spoke to the world. And in that act, the power Leto had tried to seize was transformed into something no one could steal. As she turned to leave, the museum's massive doors opening to the fading light, Clara allowed herself a quiet smile. She had walked the line between danger and destiny and emerged with something far greater than riches. History, she thought, belonged to those willing to protect it, not just for themselves, but for everyone. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel to discover more stories about how extraordinary people turn humiliation into triumph.